Someone lived with 6 corpses for 3 days. They fed the animals, cooked meals in the kitchen, tore pages off the calendar, all while 6 bodies lay stacked in the barn and scattered through the house. March 31st, 1922. A remote farmstead in Bavaria, Germany. 6 people brutally murdered with a farming tool. The killer vanished without a trace. Over a century later, this remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in German history. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck, the farm at Hinterkaifeck, sat about 43 miles north of Munich in rural Bavaria. Built around 1863, it was isolated, surrounded by dense woods. The name itself means behind Kaifeck, referring to a small hamlet nearby. In 1922, the farm was home to 6 people. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, was the patriarch. His wife, Cecilia, was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was 35 and lived there with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The family had recently hired a new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner. Andreas Gruber had a reputation in the area. Neighbors knew him as violent and aggressive, quick to attack people with whatever was nearby, a scythe, a pitchfork, even a shotgun. He was known to lock his children in the cold cellar for days during winter. One of his daughters, Sophie, died as a result of his abuse. There was something else about Andreas that people whispered about. In 1915, he and his daughter Victoria were convicted of incest. The relationship had gone on for years. Andreas served a year in prison. Victoria served 1 month. The court case came about because of Victoria's son, Joseph. People suspected Andreas was the father, not Victoria's deceased husband, Karl Gabriel. Karl had reportedly been killed in World War I in December 1914. But there were rumors he'd left Victoria shortly after their wedding because of what was happening between her and her father. A neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer had been involved with Victoria after his first wife died in 1918. He believed Joseph might be his son. At one point, he filed a complaint against Andreas for the ongoing abuse of Victoria, then withdrew it after she begged him to accept paternity of the child. He agreed, but the question of Joseph's real father hung over the family. 6 months before the murders, the family's maid, Crescens Rieger, abruptly quit. It was later claimed she'd heard footsteps in the attic and believed the farmhouse was haunted. Though there's no record of her saying this to police, the story spread. In March 1922, Andreas found a newspaper from Munich on the property. He couldn't remember buying it and thought maybe the postman had dropped it. But no one in the area subscribed to that paper. A key to the farmhouse mysteriously disappeared. Then, just days before March 31st, Andreas told neighbors he'd discovered footprints in the fresh snow. The tracks led from the forest to a broken door lock on the farm's machine room, but there were no tracks leading away. That same night, the family heard footsteps coming from the attic. Andreas went up to investigate. He found no one. He told several people about these incidents but refused help and didn't contact police. According to a school friend of young Cecilia, the girl said her mother Victoria had fled the farm on the night of March 30th, after a violent argument with her parents. She was found hours later in the forest. The next day, Friday, March 31st, Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm to begin her new job as maid. Her sister escorted her there and left after a short visit. She was likely the last person to see the family alive. Maria had only been working at Hinterkaifeck for 1 day. Late that evening, something terrible happened. Victoria, her daughter Cecilia, and her parents Andreas and his wife Cecilia were lured to the barn one by one. Someone was waiting. With a mattock, a heavy farming tool shaped like a pickaxe, the killer struck them down, blow after blow to the head. The 4 bodies were left stacked in the barn, partially covered with hay and a wooden door. The killer then went into the house. 2-year-old Joseph was asleep in his bassinet. Maria Baumgartner was in her bedroom. Both were murdered with the same weapon, brutal blows to the head. And then the killer stayed. For 3 days, someone remained at that farm with 6 corpses. The next day, Saturday, April 1st, 2 coffee sellers named Hans and Eduard Shirovsky came to Hinterhifek to take an order. They knocked on the door, no answer. They knocked on the window, still nothing. They walked around the yard but saw no one. The only thing they noticed was that the gate to the machine room was open. They decided to leave. Young Tsitsilia didn't show up to school. No excuse given. The family failed to appear for Sunday worship. People started to notice, but no one acted. On the morning of April 4th, a local mechanic named Albert Hoffner went to the farm to repair an engine. He waited for an hour, saw no one, heard nothing but farm animals and a dog howling inside the barn. After waiting, he did the repairs himself and left after about 4.5 hours. Later that afternoon, around 3:30, Lawrence Schlittenbauer sent his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Josef to check on the family. When the boys came back saying they'd seen no one, Schlittenbauer went himself. He brought 2 neighbors, Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel. When they arrived, all the doors were locked. They had to break through a gate to get into the barn. Inside, they found the bodies. Andreas, his wife Tsitsilia, their daughter Victoria, their granddaughter Tsitsilia. Then something strange happened. Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the front door of the house without issue and went inside alone. He found Maria Baumgartner dead in her bedroom. Young Joseph murdered in his crib. The investigation began immediately. Inspector Georg Reingruber from Munich was assigned to the case, but the crime scene was already contaminated. Locals had walked through the property, moving bodies, touching evidence. Some even cooked meals in the kitchen. The next day, court physician Johann Baptist Aumiller performed autopsies in the barn. The injuries were horrific. The elderly Tsitsilia had 8 holes in her skull. Victoria had 9, all on the right side of her head. She also had strangulation marks on her neck. Young Tsitsilia had been struck in the face, her jaw smashed with an iron band. Her throat had been slit with a pocket knife. She'd been found half naked. In her final moments, she'd torn out clumps of her own hair while lying in the straw. She'd been alive for hours after the attack. Andreas Gruber's injuries were different. He'd fallen or been pushed onto a heavy pickaxe, which tore open his carotid artery. He bled to death. That was his only injury. Maria Baumgartner had been struck in the head multiple times. Little Josef had been killed with a single powerful blow to the skull. The murder weapon wasn't initially found at the scene, but evidence suggested someone had been living at the farm after the killings. The cattle had been fed. All the bread in the kitchen was gone. Meat had been cut from the pantry. A calendar on the wall showed April 1st. Someone had torn off the March 31st page. On the night after the murders, a farmer named Simon Reislander was traveling home around 3 in the morning. Near Hinterhifek, he saw 2 figures standing at the edge of the forest. When they noticed him, they turned away so their faces couldn't be seen. The following night, an artisan named Michael Pluckel passed by the farm. He saw smoke from the chimney. Someone was heating the oven. An unidentified person approached him with a lantern, blinding him. Pluckel hurried away. He later told police the smoke had a revolting smell, like burning rags. This was never investigated. Police initially suspected robbery, but when they found a large amount of money in the house, that theory collapsed. A search eventually revealed more evidence. In the attic, hidden in a false floor above the kitchen, they found the mattock, 80 centimeters long, designed by Andreas himself for killing cattle, covered in dried blood. In the hayloft, they found signs someone had been living there. Haystacks arranged like a hiding spot, roof tiles removed to create a lookout, carpet placed down to muffle footsteps, ropes attached to beams, possibly for a quick escape, evidence of defecation, rinds of smoked meat. Someone had been watching, waiting. Police began looking at suspects. The first was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. Though reported killed in World War I, his body was never recovered. After the murders, people wondered if he'd actually died. Maybe he'd come back for revenge, suspecting Joseph wasn't his son. 2 soldiers who'd served with Carl said they'd identified his body on the battlefield. But after World War II, some German prisoners claimed they'd been released by a German-speaking Soviet officer who said he was the Hinterhifek murderer. Some thought this might have been Carl Gabriel. The men later revised their statements and the theory lost credibility. Then there was Lawrence Schlittenbauer himself. He came under suspicion early because of his behavior at the crime scene. When he and his neighbors arrived, all the doors were locked. They had to break in. But immediately after finding the bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer unlocked the front door with a key and entered the house alone. A key had gone missing from the Gruber household days before the murders. When asked why he went inside alone when the killer might still be there, Schlittenbauer said he went to look for Joseph. He'd disturbed the bodies, potentially compromising evidence. For years, Schlittenbauer remained under suspicion. In 1925, a teacher found him visiting the demolished remains of Hinterhifek. When asked why he was there, Schlittenbauer said the killer's attempt to bury the bodies had been stopped by frozen ground. How would he know that unless he was there? Before his death in 1941, Schlittenbauer won several lawsuits for slander against people who called him the Hinterhifek murderer. If he knew something, he took it to his grave. The former maid, Kretzens Rieger, gave police several names. She suspected Anton Bichler and his brother Carl. Anton had worked the potato harvest at Hinterhifek and knew the farm. Rieger said he often talked about the family and suggested they ought to be dead. She also claimed the family dog, who barked at everyone, never barked at Anton. She thought the Bichlers might have worked with Georg Siegel, another farmhand who knew about the family's money. Siegel admitted he'd carved the handle of the mattock when he worked there and knew where it was kept. Rieger also suspected brothers Joseph and Andreas Thaler, known burglars in the area. She said Joseph once stood at her window at night asking questions about the family. He claimed to know which room each person slept in and that they had money hidden in the house. In May 1927, 5 years after the murders, something bizarre happened. A stranger stopped a resident of Weidhofen at midnight and asked about the murders. Then he shouted that he was the killer and ran into the forest. He was never identified. One modern theory suggests Andreas Gruber himself was the killer, that he murdered his family in a rage, then spent the next day tending the farm. This would explain why someone was there for 3 days. He had nowhere else to go. Then someone, possibly Schlittenbauer, discovered what happened and killed Andreas in the barn. Another theory comes from author Bill James, who wrote about a suspected serial killer named Paul Müller. Müller was a German immigrant believed responsible for multiple axe murders across America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The crimes share similarities with Hinterhifek: isolated families, blunt farm tools as weapons, bodies stacked, no robbery. James suspects Müller might have returned to Germany by 1912 after his pattern was noticed. But there's no solid evidence linking him to Hinterhifek. In 2007, students from a police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck reopened the case using modern techniques. They confirmed the original investigation was thorough, but criticized the lack of fingerprinting, which was standard practice at the time. All the students independently agreed on who the main suspect was, but they refused to name him out of respect for his descendants. Less than a year after the murders, the farm was demolished. A small concrete memorial now stands where Hinterhifek once was. The case was officially closed in 1955. The last interrogations happened in 1986. It's been over a century. 6 people were brutally murdered on a remote farm in Bavaria. The killer lived with their bodies for 3 days, fed the animals, cooked meals, watched the road, then disappeared. No one was ever charged, no one was ever caught. And no one knows for certain what happened in that barn on the night of March 31st, 1922. The Hinterhifek murders remain one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in history.